Alright, so first we're going to take a look at how to execute our query using useQuery from Apollo Client inside of our React project. Then we're going to take a look at how to pass variables or arguments inside of our GraphQL query. And because the data that we query are stored in the cache, we can be able to use something like pool interval or refetch to be able to keep our data fresh. And we're also going to cover the useLazyQuery from the Apollo Client, which we can be able to manually trigger or execute our query. And lastly, we're going to take a look at how to set effective fetch policies like network only, cache first, and such. And of course, if you're interested in more content like this, please make sure to subscribe to this channel and like this video. And the timestamp of this video is in the description below, so feel free to jump to any section you like. And if so far sounds interesting, let's get started. All right, so here you can see we have a GraphQL server, which in this case can be able to send queries, mutations, and subscriptions. And then we're going to add our React project with TypeScript. And inside of our index file, we're going to import some packages from Apollo Client, and then we're going to create an instance of Apollo Client, which we're going to call our localhost 4000 for our GraphQL server. And then we're going to pass the client to the Apollo provider, which we can be able to use it throughout our React application. And to write a simple GraphQL query, what we're going to do is we're going to import the GraphQL parser function as well as the useQuery from the Apollo Client. And we're going to wrap it around our GraphQL parser function and then pass it to the useQuery. And this will give us the following data, which has the loading, error, as well as the data. And then we can be able to output our data on our page or just log it for now for simplicity. And then we basically import our feed inside of our app component. And if we were to navigate our browser and refresh, and you can see that this is the data that we fetched from our response. And of course, we can also be able to pass arguments inside of our React GraphQL query. So on our playground, you can see that for the query of feed, we can be able to pass arguments like filter, skip, tick, order by. And for example, order by, which has a type of link order by input, which have additional properties that we can be able to specify. Each property has a enum. So in this case, we can be able to sort by description in ascending order or descending order, and same thing for the URL and the created at. So here, what we can do is inside of our GraphQL parser function, we can be able to specify the sorted by. And in this case, it has a type of link order by input. And then we're trying to get this type of result. And then we just pass it to our useQuery. And then inside of our useQuery, we have this options where we can be able to specify the variables. And here inside of the options, we're defining the variables sorted by the created at in ascending order. And then here you can see back to our page, I add some styling. Each of those items sorted by the created at time in ascending order. And of course, I can also make them in descending order. So by changing the variables here, and now you can see all of them are sorted in a descending order. So by default, when user try to render our component, it sends a query to our GraphQL cache. So it checks to see if this query has already been run. So for example, let's say we have this query, try to get dogs, and then we check to see if the cache has the data. And if the cache does not have the data, then we're going to fetch it from our GraphQL server. And once the data is returned from our GraphQL server, it will store in our cache, so that every time when this component re-render again, when we send the same query, it will basically retrieve the data from our cache. You can also be able to update our cache query results by either using pooling or refetching. So pooling, we can be able to set the pooling interval, which in this case, we can be able to set for example, 500 milliseconds. And this will basically fetch the query data every 500 milliseconds. And then we can also be able to do refetching, and we can be able to call this function in a use effect or in a user action. And to demonstrate the pooling, what we're going to do is we're going to, inside of the options, we're going to add the pooling interval. And then we're going to set it, for example, every 5 seconds or every 2 seconds, the data will be fetched. So if we were to save this and jump back to our query, you can see that every 5 seconds, we send another request to our GraphQL server, and we'll basically get our data refetched. And let's say if we were to update this data, so instead of GraphQL, we're going to say Prisma, save this, and now you can see the data is changed because it refreshed every 2 seconds. And now to try our query's refetch function, here what I did is I added a button which called refetch, and this will basically triggered a refetch callback from our useQuery. So now if we were to navigate to our page, and if we were to click on refetch, you can see the data is refetched, and we send a query in our network. And now if I were to change some data, for example, about Prisma DB, for example, and save the changes and come back and refetch again, and you can see the latest data has been fetched. All right, so at this moment, you can see when this component has been rendered, we send this GraphQL query. But what if we want to delay this query? What if we want to manually send the GraphQL query? In this case, what we can do is we can use something called useLazyQuery, which we can be able to manually execute the query in our component. So to do so, we're going to import the useLazyQuery from the Apollo client. And then this will basically return a tuple, which has the get feed function, which has the get function to call the query. And this is the data that's going to be returned from our result. And then here, instead of the refetch, I'm just going to call it the get feed and basically call the get feed and pass the variables here. And then now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our page. And if we were to click on the button, you can see that we have our data, which got fetched from our GraphQL query. So by default, when we load the feed component, it sends the query to our cache to see if it has the data. And if it does, then we're just going to return it to the component. If it doesn't, we're going to fetch it from our GraphQL server. But what if we don't want to check the cache? Well, in this case, we can be able to specify the fetch policy. And then if we set the fetch policy to network only, and this will basically send our query to our GraphQL server instead of our cache. For fetch policy, it's only used for the first execution when we send the query, but for the subsequent executions, then we can be able to use something called nextFetchPolicy, which in this case, we can be able to change it to something else like cache first, which in this case, we're going to just fetch the data from our cache first before we send the request to the network. Or we can be able to change it to a different policy. And if we don't want to add this kind of policy in every use queries, we can be able to also configure this inside of the Apollo client. So for default options, we can change that to the cache only. By default, obviously it's cache only, but we can also change it to network only or other fetch policies. And you can see here, there are many caches policies that we can choose from if we want to set a different policy than the default one.